Dim the lights, settle in, and feel the soft hum of the evening. Tonight, we look beyond the cold, white marble of ancient Greece. Forget the heroic legends for a moment. We are stepping into the sun-baked reality of mud brick homes, straw mattresses, and the bitter taste of stale barley bread. It was a life of invisible labor, bronze blades, and divine tantrums. Welcome to the harder truth behind the glory. Let's journey together. History is a grand deception, a tapestry woven with the gilded threads of kings and the silence of the forgotten. Yet beneath the bleached marble of the Parthenon and the echoing rhetoric of the Agora lies a truth more visceral than any epic, the sheer, brutal weight of existing. We gaze upon statues of poised perfection, frozen in an eternal, pantless grace, but we rarely smell the dust, the sweat, and the iron-scented desperation of those whose lives were not sculpted in stone, but ground into the unforgiving dirt of Hellas. To walk the streets of the ancient world is not to visit a museum. It is to enter a crucible where the sun is a predator, the water is a luxury, and every sunrise is a tenuous truce with a slow, agonizing mortality. Imagine a world where the horizon does not promise discovery, but demands endurance. The Mediterranean sun is not the gentle muse of poets here. It is a celestial furnace, a blinding eye that scours the landscape until the very earth screams in shades of ochre and bone. In the height of summer, the air becomes a physical weight, thick with the scent of parched thyme and the salt of the distant Aegean. Yet there is no respite in the shade. You do not wake to the chime of an instrument or the call of a servant. You rise because the heat has turned your very sanctuary into a kiln. Your dwelling is not a feat of architecture, but a desperate plea for shelter. Walls of sun-dried mud bricks, porous and crude, that act as a sponge for the day's fury. By midday, these walls do not protect, they radiate. They breathe back the fire they have stolen from the sky, pressing it against your skin until your bones feel as brittle as the dust beneath your feet. There is no glass to soften the glare, only heavy wooden shutters that you pull tight, trapping yourself in a suffocating darkness shared with the rhythmic, pungent breath of a family goat huddling in the corner, the only other creature as weary as you. In this realm of dust, privacy is a myth of the wealthy, a concept as foreign as the northern mists. You live, sleep, and labor in a communal tangle of limbs and unspoken grievances. The morning ritual begins not with comfort, but with the heavy, rhythmic clatter of clay. There is no stream that flows to your door, no silver tap to grant you life. To drink is to labor. You heave the massive amphora onto your shoulder, its weight a familiar ache that has carved a permanent groove into your muscle. The journey to the public fountain or the deep, dark throat of a rural well is a pilgrimage of necessity. Each step on the sun-baked stone is a gamble. To trip is to see a week's worth of labor shatter into 1,000 jagged shards, bleeding the precious liquid into the thirsty soil. When you finally return, the water is not for immersion. It is a holy relic, rationed for the parched throat and the meager pot. Cleanliness in the ancient world is not an act of refreshment, but a ritual of scraping away the day's accumulation of toil. Forget the phantom scents of modern alchemy. Your soap is the fruit of the olive tree, and your towel is a blade of cold bronze. You slather your limbs in thick, viscous oil, not to soften the skin, but to trap the grit, the soot, and the salt of your own exertion. Then comes the strigil. The curved metal edge bites into the oil, dragging a gray, muddy slurry across your flesh in a process that is less a bath and more a shedding of a second, filthier skin. You perform this in the open, amidst the clamor of the streets or the communal heat of the basin, exposed to the judgmental eyes of a society that views the body as a public ledger of one's status and health. You emerge not scented with flowers, but smelling of musk, earth, and the metallic tang of the blade, a uniquely Greek fragrance of survival. Even the act of nourishment is a grim affair, a utilitarian transaction with hunger that offers no joy. Breakfast is not a celebration, but a fortification. You sit in the dim light of your mud brick oven, holding a slab of maza, barley bread so dense and stale it rivals the stones it was baked upon. This is the barley brick, a gray, flavorless mass of ground grain and water, often burnt at the edges and crawling with the persistent, buzzing ghosts of yesterday's flies. You do not feast, you endure. You dunk the brittle crust into a cup of wine, so heavily diluted with questionable water that it carries only the ghost of the vine. You drink not for the intoxication, but because the water alone is a vessel for sickness, a gamble you cannot afford to take. If the gods are unusually kind, perhaps there is a shriveled fig or a smear of pungent goat cheese. But for the most part, you chew in a somber, rhythmic silence. There are no chairs to cradle your weary frame, no forks to bridge the gap between hand and mouth. You eat quickly, standing or squatting, for time is the only currency the sun allows. And if you are a woman, even this meager ritual is performed in the shadows, waiting for the men to finish their portion of the dust before you may claim your own share of disappointment. As you step out into the blinding glare, your wardrobe offers no shield. You wrap yourself in the chiton, a simple, unshaped rectangle of linen pinned at the shoulders, a garment that defies geometry and offers a precarious modesty. It is a toga burrito of necessity, unyielding and scratchy, clinging to your sweat-slicked skin in ways that mock your dignity. Underwear is a luxury of the future. Here, you are one loose pin away from a public scandal, a thought that occupies the back of your mind as you navigate the crowded, dung-strewn arteries of the city. Your feet, encased in thin leather sandals or perhaps bare and calloused, meet the white-hot pavement of the roads. You walk through a landscape of contradictions, the soaring, magnificent pillars of a temple dedicated to a god who does not know your name, and the open-air sewers that carry the refuse of 1,000 lives past your toes. The sun begins its slow, deliberate ascent to the zenith, and you realize that the day has only just begun. Is this the cradle of civilization, or is it a beautiful marble-clad cage? We speak of their democracy, yet 90% of the voices are stifled by the weight of their own chains or the silence of their gender. We speak of their philosophy, yet for the man hauling grain or the woman spinning wool, the unexamined life is not a choice but a luxury they cannot buy. In this world, the gods are not loving shepherds. They are temperamental titans who might strike you with a plague because you forgot a drop of wine, or drown your brother because they had a spat on Olympus. You live in the shadow of their whims, a flickering candle in a storm of bronze and dust. To survive a single day in ancient Greece is to win a war against the elements, against the body, and against the very gods themselves. This is the foundation upon which the West was built, not on the speeches of poets, but on the broken backs and sun-scorched spirits of those who refused to die in the shadows. Welcome to the ancient world. Try not to break your teeth on the bread. The sun has barely crested the horizon, yet its heat is already a predatory force, reclaiming the world from the cool, indifferent shadows of the night. You have emerged from the kiln-like confines of your mud brick home, your skin still glistening with the residue of olive oil and the metallic scent of the bronze strigil, that cold, curved blade that serves as your only defense against the encroaching grime of existence. But before the heavy labor of the day can claim your spirit, the body demands its tribute. In the grand myths, the heroes feast upon ambrosia and nectar, but here, in the dust of the mundane, life is sustained by a far more harrowing substance. Welcome to the ritual of the bitter bread. Consider the maza. It is not a loaf of leisure, nor a delicacy of the hearth. It is a dense, sun-grayed slab of survival. To call it bread is an act of poetic mercy. In the dim light of the morning embers, you hold this barley brick, a utilitarian mass of ground grain and brackish water, shaped by calloused hands and baked upon the very stones that radiate the earth's heat. There is no yeast to grant it lightness, no salt to mask its austerity. It is a texture of survival, stale, unyielding, and flavored with the lingering ash of last night's fire. As you tear into its coarse exterior, you are reminded that in the ancient world, nourishment is a transaction of necessity, not a celebration of the senses. This is the diet of the Stoic, the fuel for a body destined to be ground between the gears of history. There are no sweet fruits to soften the morning, no honeyed cakes to ease the transition into consciousness. Unless, perhaps, you have found favor with a local beekeeper, or the gods have seen fit to grant you a shriveled, dusty figure. For the common man, the maza is the alpha and the omega of the morning, a substance so devoid of joy it makes the modern fast seem like a banquet of gluttony. Beside the bread sits a vessel of clay, containing the only liquid that offers a truce with the thirst that consumes you. You do not reach for water, for in the crowded veins of the city or the parched throat of the countryside, the water is a gamble with the grave. It carries the unseen ghosts of sickness, a liquid betrayal that few can afford to trust. Instead, you drink oinos wine. But this is not the wine of the symposium, the dark, intoxicating nectar that fuels the debates of philosophers. This is a survivalist's vintage, heavily diluted with water until it is little more than a memory of the vine. You drink it not for the buzz, but for the salvation it provides. The fermentation is the only filter you possess to kill the death lurking in the well. From the youngest child to the oldest elder, the morning begins with this rhythmic, somber intake of vine-scented water, a communal shield against the invisible plagues of the ancient world. In this small, smoke-stained space, the meal is consumed in a silence that is almost religious. There are no chairs to cradle your frame, no silver forks to distance you from the earthiness of your food. You squat or stand, your fingers meeting the grain directly, a visceral connection to the soil that produced it. But notice the shadows in the corner. If you are a woman in this household, your hunger must wait for its turn. The domestic sphere is governed by a brutal, silent hierarchy. The men, the laborers, the potential soldiers of the phalanx, consume their portion first, claiming the lion's share of the dust and the calories. You wait in the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters, watching the men fuel themselves for a world you are forbidden to enter. Your meal is the remains, the cold crumbs of a disappointment that has been decades in the making. In the cradle of democracy, the table is the first place where the voice of the many is silenced by the needs of the few. Once the stomach is quieted by the barley brick, the body must be prepared for the theater of the public eye. You wrap yourself in the chiton, that primitive rectangle of linen that serves as your only barrier between your skin and the judgmental glare of the Mediterranean sun. It is a garment of terrifying simplicity, pinned at the shoulders and cinched at the waist, a toga burrito that offers a precarious modesty. There is no underwear to provide comfort, no tailored seams to flatter the form. There is only the linen, which soon becomes a second skin, damp with sweat and clinging to your limbs in ways that defy the geometry of the soul. As you step into your sandals, if the fates have granted you the wealth of leather, you prepare for the commute of the ancient world. You walk not upon pavements of gold, but upon sunbaked stone and goat-trodden dirt, dodging the refuse of a city that has no concept of the hidden sewer. Each step is a reminder of your mortality, the heat of the road rising through the thin soles of your shoes to cook your feet as the sun cooks your spirit. We look back at this era and see the soaring marble of the Acropolis, the perfect proportions of the Parthenon, and the high-minded rhetoric of Pericles. But the truth of ancient Greece was not written in the stars. It was etched into the weary muscles of the man who choked down a stale barley brick so he could spend 12 hours hauling stone. It was written in the silent endurance of the woman who ground that barley into dust, her life a repetitive cycle of weaving, baking, and waiting. Is this the golden age, or is it a masterpiece of human suffering gilded in white stone? To survive the morning in the ancient world was to engage in a war of attrition with the mundane. The bread was bitter, the wine was weak, and the sun was an indifferent executioner. Yet, from this crucible of dust and ash, a civilization emerged, not because life was easy, but because these people found a way to weave meaning into the very fabric of their hardship. They chewed through the stale bread of existence, and, with their remaining breath, they invented the soul of the West. The meal is finished. The chiton is pinned. The street calls with its cacophony of vendors, philosophers, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the bronze-clad soldier. Your back already aches, your throat is already dry, and the true burden of the day has yet to begin. For in this world, survival is not a given. It is a daily, agonizing conquest. And as the sun reaches its zenith, the shadow of the sword begins to lengthen across the land. The bitter taste of the barley brick still lingers on your tongue, a dry reminder of the meager life you struggle to sustain. But the sun, now climbing toward its cruel zenith, no longer merely burns the skin. It reflects off the polished surface of a looming metallic fate. In the ancient world, to be a man is not to be an individual. It is to be a cell in a larger, more lethal organism. You have scraped away the dirt with your bronze blade, but soon, that same bronze will not be a tool of hygiene, but a shroud of duty. The transition from the hearth to the battlefield is not a choice made in a moment of patriotic fervor. It is as inevitable as the tide and as heavy as the earth itself. In the shadows of the marble temples, beneath the soaring rhetoric of democracy and justice, lies the iron-scented reality of civic life. Military service is not a profession, but a birthright of blood. Whether you walk the sophisticated streets of Athens or the austere paths of Sparta, your identity is forged in the armory. By the time your beard begins to darken, you are already a soldier in waiting, caught in a system where peace is merely a fleeting pause between two invasions. Even the masters of thought, the men who would define the very essence of the human soul, were not exempt from the mud and the slaughter. Socrates, the man who questioned the nature of virtue, did not do so only in the comfort of the agora. He did so while gripping a spear, his feet calloused by the long marches of the Peloponnesian War. There is no conscientious objector in the ancient world. To refuse the shield is to refuse the city, to vanish into the social void of the coward. If you are born in Sparta, the weight of bronze begins to press upon you while you are still a child. At the age of 7, while boys in other lands still play in the dust, you are cast into the agoge, a state-sponsored crucible of systematic brutality designed to strip away the boy and leave only the weapon. Imagine a childhood defined not by a mother's touch, but by the lash and the hollow ache of hunger. You are starved intentionally, not out of scarcity, but to teach you the cunning of a predator. You are whipped until the stone floor is slick with your own blood, not as punishment, but as an initiation into the brotherhood of pain. In the agoge, you are isolated, left to sleep on a mat of broken reeds you harvested by hand, learning that the only warmth in this world comes from the man standing next to you in the line. By the time you reach manhood, you do not fear death. You have already lived a life that makes the grave seem like a sanctuary. But for most, the horror is not in the training, but in the equipment. The ancient world operates on a brutal economic reality. Bring your own bronze. Your survival is tied directly to your wealth. If you are a man of means, you encase yourself in a panoply of gleaming, unforgiving metal. The bronze helmet that restricts your vision to a narrow, terrifying slit. The breastplate that turns your chest into a statue. The greaves that bite into your shins. This armor is a masterpiece of craftsmanship and a miracle of discomfort. It is heavy, it is hot, and it smells of sweat and oil, turning your very body into a furnace under the Mediterranean sun. But the true weight lies in the hoplon, the massive, circular shield of wood and bronze. It is designed not just to protect you, but to protect the man to your left. To drop it is the ultimate sin. A man may lose his helmet or his breastplate for his own sake, but he carries his shield for the sake of the entire city. If you are poor, however, the weight of bronze is a luxury you cannot afford. You enter the fray with nothing but leather, cloth, and a desperate prayer that the arrows find another target. In the hierarchy of the battlefield, The thickness of your bronze is the measure of your worth, and those without it are the first to be ground into the red-soaked dirt. To stand in the phalanx is to experience a unique form of psychological erasure. As the enemy approaches, the world shrinks to the width of the shield rim in front of you. You are no longer a father, a son, or a philosopher. You are a single scale on a bronze-clad beast. The air grows thick with the scent of ozone, dust, and the primal musk of 1,000 terrified men. The order is given, and the beast moves. There is no room for heroics, no space for individual glory. The phalanx relies on a terrifying intimacy. You are pressed so tightly against your comrades that you can feel the frantic rhythm of the heart of the man behind you. When the lines collide, it is not a duel of swords, but a grinding, suffocating wall of muscle and metal. The sound is a cacophony of bronze screaming against bronze, the snap of spears, and the guttural cries of men being crushed under the sheer physical weight of the opposing line. In this space, the unexamined life is not lived. It is ended in an instant of iron and agony. And what of those who survive the bronze embrace? The ancient world has no words for the invisible wounds of the mind. There is no veterans' health care, no pension for the man who left his arm in the mud of a distant shore, no therapy for the soul that still hears the screams of the dying in the middle of the night. You return to your mud brick home, your body a map of scars, and your mind a fractured mirror of the violence you have witnessed. If you are lucky, you receive a poorly carved gravestone praising your virtue, a cold comfort for a life spent in the service of a state that has already forgotten your name. You go back to the barley bread and the diluted wine, but the weight of the bronze never truly leaves your shoulders. We celebrate the glory of Greece, but that glory was bought with the currency of broken bones and extinguished lives. The temples were built on the backs of the enslaved, and the democracy was defended by the deaths of the young. The weight of bronze was the price of civilization, a heavy metallic toll that every man was forced to pay. As you look upon the statues today, remember that they are not just art. They are the idealized ghosts of men who were once warm, breathing, and terrified. They lived in a world where the gods were capricious and the state was absolute, and where the only thing more certain than the heat of the sun was the cold, heavy bite of the spear. The thunder of the phalanx has subsided, and the gleaming bronze that defined the citizen's life is laid aside, cooling in the corner of a mud brick home. But as the metallic echoes of war fade into the parched silence of the Mediterranean afternoon, a different kind of weight begins to reveal itself, a weight not of metal, but of invisibility. The glory of Greece is a sunlit stage, yet every actor standing in the light is supported by a vast, trembling scaffolding of shadows. To understand the ancient world is to listen to the silence of the 90%. The voices that were never recorded on papyrus, the lives that were never sculpted in marble, and the souls who built the cradle of democracy while standing firmly outside its doors. Turn your gaze away from the bustling agora and the shouting men of the assembly. Follow the winding, dust-choked alleys to the interior of the home, to a space known as the gynaeconitis. This is the women's quarters, a realm of latticed shadows and rhythmic, endless toil. If you are a woman in Athens, your world is a box of sun-dried mud, and your life is measured in the repetitive motion of the loom. You are the household CEO, the silent architect of domestic survival, yet you are a ghost in your own city. You wake before the sun, your fingers already calloused from spinning wool and grinding grain. You manage the household, you raise the children, and you bake the bitter bread we spoke of, yet you have fewer rights than a pile of decorative urns. You cannot vote, you cannot own land, and you cannot walk the streets without a male guardian to shield your fragile reputation from the gaze of a society that views your presence in public as a scandal. Your education is not one of rhetoric or geometry. It is a training in invisibility, a preparation for a life where your primary value is your womb and your primary virtue is your silence. Consider the tragedy of the wedding night. In the prime of your early teens, when the world should be widening, yours narrows to a single, terrifying contract. You are not a person being joined in love. You are a trade agreement brokered by your father. Your husband is often a man twice your age, a stranger whose face is lined with the dust of wars you never saw and debates you were never allowed to hear. Love is an optional ghost in this arrangement. The dowry is the only mandatory guest. You move from the shadow of a father to the shadow of a husband, a transition marked not by joy, but by the heavy realization that you are property. Even your mourning is regulated, your social life limited to glimpses through narrow windows, watching a world move on without your participation. In the land that invented the unexamined life, yours is a life examined only by the men who own your future. In the north, in the iron-cold valleys of Sparta, the silence is different. Here, women are not hidden, they are displayed. They exercise in public, they are educated, and they even own property. But do not mistake this for liberation. This freedom is merely a different form of conscription. In Sparta, you are not a weaver, you are a factory for warriors. Your body belongs to the state, and your worth is measured by the strength of the sons you produce for the agoge. To give birth to a weakling is a disgrace. To lose a son in battle is your highest achievement. Even in their liberation, the women of Sparta are tethered to the bronze shield of the state, their lives defined by a machine of perpetual war. But beneath the silenced women lies a deeper, darker strata of the ancient world. Slavery in Greece was not a footnote, it was the foundation. It was as ubiquitous as the sun and as unquestioned as the tides. Even the most modest household, struggling to scrape together enough barley for the morning meal, likely owned another human being. This was not a slavery of race, but a slavery of circumstance, a thresher that caught Thracians, Syrians, and even fellow Greeks who found themselves on the wrong side of a city-state's fury. Imagine the marketplace of flesh, where men, women, and children are sold like livestock. Once purchased, you are no longer a person, you are a living tool. You cook the meals, you carry the heavy amphory of water, and you stand silently at the edge of the symposium, watching your master debate the nature of justice, while you wait to clean the vomit from the floor. There is a profound, sickening irony in the fact that the greatest philosophical minds of the West, men like Aristotle, did not merely tolerate this, they justified it. To Aristotle, some were simply slaves by nature, born with the soul of a servant, designed by the gods to be the fuel for the citizen's intellect. If you are fortunate, your slavery is domestic. But if you are cast into the silver mines of Laurion, you have entered a living Hades. Here, the glory of Athens is forged in toxic dust and absolute darkness. Thousands of slaves, including children, spend their entire lives crawling through narrow, oxygen-starved shafts, their lungs filling with lead-heavy air. They die slowly, unmarked and forgotten, so that the city can mint the silver coins that pay for its temples and its wars. In the mines, there is no democracy. There are only the rhythmic clink of the pickaxe and the silence of the grave. When the Parthenon gleams white against the blue Aegean sky, it is the silver from these dark, suffocating holes that paid for the marble. The beauty of the Acropolis is built upon a mountain of broken bodies that were never allowed to see the light they helped create. We call it the birthplace of democracy, and technically we are right. But we must confront the math of the ancient world. To vote in the assembly, to be a free citizen, you had to be a male born of Athenian parents over the age of 18. This elite club represented barely 10% of the population. The other 90%, the women, the foreigners, medics, and the vast sea of slaves, were the silent observers of their own oppression. The voice of the people was, in reality, a small chorus of sunburned men in sandals, debating the fate of a city whose real labor was performed by the voiceless. If you had shown up at the assembly expecting equal rights, you would have been escorted out, a reminder that in the ancient world, equality, was a luxury reserved for the few who held the spear and the shield. What does it mean for a civilization to invent ethics while maintaining a system of human cattle? How do we reconcile the soaring poetry of Sappho or the logic of Plato with the toxic dust of the silver mines? The ancient world does not offer an easy answer. It offers a mirror. It shows us that progress is often bought with a currency of suffering we refuse to acknowledge. The silenced voices of the ancient world are not gone. They are the cracks in the marble, the salt in the soil, and the enduring tragedy of a history that chose to remember the kings but forget the hands that fed them. When you look at the ruins today, do not just see the pillars, see the shadows between them. For in those shadows lie the true architects of the West, those who were never allowed to speak, yet whose labor remains etched into the very stones of time. The sun sets over the agora, and the men return to their homes, satisfied with their debates on liberty and the soul. Inside, the women douse the oil lamps in the gynaeconitis, their day's work finally ending in the dark. In the mines, the pickaxes never stop. The silence of the night is not a peace. It is a temporary truce in a world built on injustice. The heavy, oppressive silence of the women's quarters and the rhythmic, subterranean clink of the slave's pickaxe fade into the distance, replaced by a new kind of cacophony. We ascend from the shadows of the home and the mines to the sun-drenched heights of the Nyx, the rocky heart of Athenian political life. Here, beneath an uncompromising sky, the air vibrates with the roar of thousands of voices, the sound of the world's first democracy in its rawest, most volatile form. But do not be deceived by the soaring marble pillars or the poetic odes to Eleutheria, liberty. In the ancient world, freedom was not a warm embrace, it was a sharpened blade, and the very system designed to empower the citizen was the same mechanism used to erase him. We are told that Athens was the cradle of the people's voice, a revolutionary experiment where the many ruled the few. Yet, as you stand amidst the sea of sun-browned shoulders and dusty sandals, the math of this freedom reveals a darker geometry. To have a voice in this assembly, to be a member of this ecclesia, you had to survive a gauntlet of exclusions. You had to be male, born of 2 Athenian parents, and of age. The vast majority of the city, the 90% comprised of the women we left in the shadows, the foreigners who paid the taxes, and the slaves who built the very stone seats upon which the citizens sit, are ghosts in this theater of power. This is not democracy for humanity. It is a prestigious, high-stakes club for a specific caste of men. For those outside the circle, the illusion of liberty is a bitter pill, a spectacle of rights they are forced to subsidize with their labor, but are never permitted to touch. Watch the process unfold. This is not a world of professional politicians or career bureaucrats. In the Athenian experiment, the state is an amateur's playground, governed by the terrifying whims of a lottery. Through a system of chance, a fishmonger who spent his morning arguing over the price of sea bass might find himself overseeing the city's treasury by noon. An uncle who still believes the sun is a chariot driven by a literal god might be randomly selected to judge a murder trial, his uneducated vote carrying the weight of life and death. There is a frantic, kinetic energy to this governance. Laws are not drafted in quiet rooms. They are shouted into existence in assemblies of 6,000 men, where the most persuasive orator, or the loudest, commands the destiny of the state. It is a system built on the belief that every citizen is a legislator, a juror, and a soldier all at once. But this total immersion in the civic machine carries a heavy psychological toll. In Athens, you are never truly private. Your life is a public ledger, and your neighbors are your auditors. As the seasons turn and the heat of midwinter begins to yield to the spring, a specific kind of tension settles over the city. It is the time of the ostracophoria, the ritual of the pottery shard. Once a year, the citizens gather not to elect a leader, but to decide if someone among them has become too prominent, too influential, or simply too annoying to remain within the walls. This is the dark heartbeat of the democratic illusion, the fear of excellence. In a society that worships isonomia, equality, to stand too tall is to invite the scythe. You do not have to commit a crime to be destroyed. You only have to be successful. A war hero who saved the city from a Persian onslaught, a philosopher with too much charisma, or even a man whose only sin is having great hair. All are potential victims of the ostracan. Imagine the scene. Thousands of citizens, their faces etched with a mixture of civic duty and petty resentment, holding small, jagged pieces of broken pottery. With a stylus, they scratch a single name into the clay, the name of a man they wish to yeet into the void of the countryside. There is no trial. There is no defense. There is no cross-examination of the evidence. There is only the count. If 6,000 shards bear your name, your life in Athens is over in an instant. You are granted 10 days to pack your sandals and your oil, and then you are cast out into a 10-year exile. Your property remains, your family is safe, but you are a ghost to your own people. A man whose presence has been voted into non-existence by the very neighbors you defended in the phalanx. It is the ancient world's version of cancel culture, written in the dust of broken urns 2,500 years before the invention of the digital screen. The history of this ritual is a litany of ironies. Consider Aristides, known as the Just, a man of such unshakable virtue that his very name was a synonym for integrity. Legend tells of an illiterate citizen who approached Aristides during a vote, not knowing who he was, and asked him to write the name Aristides on his shard. When the statesman asked what wrong this Aristides had done, the man replied simply, "None. I am just tired of hearing everyone call him the Just." Even Themistocles, the military genius whose naval strategy at Salamis saved the very existence of Athens, found that gratitude has a short expiration date. Once his usefulness faded and his cockiness grew too heavy for the assembly to bear, he was cast out, the hero of the city becoming a wanderer in the lands he once fought to protect. In the illusion of liberty, the state is a jealous god that tolerates no rivals. What we call democracy, the ancients lived as a state of perpetual anxiety. To be a citizen was to walk a tightrope between participation and erasure. If you were too quiet, you were a private person, idiots, a man of no account. If you were too loud, you were a target for the ostracan. This is the foundational tragedy of the West. The discovery of the individual's voice was immediately followed by the invention of a system to silence it. The Nix was not just a place of freedom. It was a theater of judgment where the tyranny of the majority could be as suffocating as the reign of any king. You are free to speak, yes, but every word you utter is a gamble, and every neighbor who smiles at you might be carrying a piece of broken pottery with your name on it in his pocket. Is a society truly free if its primary political tool is banishment? Can we celebrate the rule of the people when the people are a tiny, sunburned elite built on a foundation of silenced millions? The ancient world offers no comfort here. It only offers the image of a man standing at the city gates, looking back at the marble temples he helped build, clutching a small bag of belongings as he begins a 10-year journey into the silence of the wilderness. The liberty of Athens was a flickering candle in a storm of human jealousy and divine whim. It was a beautiful, marble-clad illusion that required constant sacrifices at the altar of the average. And as the sun sets over the Nix, casting long, distorted shadows across the shards of discarded pottery, we realize that the most dangerous thing in the ancient world wasn't the enemy at the gates. It was the neighbor with a stylus. The assembly disperses. The votes are counted. The shards are swept into heaps of forgotten names. You return to your mud brick home, heart heavy with the knowledge that for another year you are safe. But the fear remains, a cold, metallic residue that no amount of olive oil can scrape away. For in the heart of the democracy, the voice that empowers you is the same voice that can exile you into the dust. The dust of the assembly has settled, and the jagged shards of the ostracan lie forgotten in the dirt, their power to exile having been spent for another season. Yet the anxiety of the citizen does not vanish with the setting sun, it merely migrates. To escape the suffocating weight of political fear and the relentless heat of a life built on the backs of the silenced, the Greeks did not seek the shallow distractions of the modern age. They did not look for comfort. Instead, they marched by the thousands toward the hillside, toward a stone crucible carved into the very bones of the earth. They sought the theater, not to forget their suffering, but to elevate it into something divine. As the first light of the Dionysia festival touches the marble tiers of the great theater, we transition from the theater of politics to the politics of the soul. Imagine an immense, open-air amphitheater, a sweeping arc of limestone seats rising like a frozen wave against the slopes of the Acropolis. Here, shoulder to shoulder with 10,000 other souls, the distinctions of the city begin to blur. For a few days each spring, the city-state of Athens holds its breath. This is the festival of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and transformation, and the theater is his temple. The air is thick, a pungent, uniquely Greek blend of unwashed tunics, parched earth, and the sweet, heavy scent of sacrificial wine. There are no intermissions here, no snacks to cushion the blow of the narrative. You sit in the uncompromising glare of the sun from dawn until dusk, your body a prisoner to the stone, and your spirit a prisoner to the stage. Down in the orchestra, the circular dancing floor at the heart of the theater, the transformation begins. The actors appear, but they are not men as you know them. They are towering, semi-divine figures, elevated by platform shoes, the cothurni, that grant them a ghostly, unnatural height. Their faces are not their own. They are encased in massive, stylized masks of wood and linen, their features frozen in eternal expressions of grief, rage, or hollow-eyed despair. These masks act as acoustic funnels, casting the actor's voice to the furthest reaches of the stone tiers, but they serve a deeper, metaphysical purpose. They strip away the individual and leave only the archetype. In this space, an actor, always male, even when portraying the most formidable of queens, becomes a vessel for a suffering that is older than the city itself. Between the audience and the towering heroes stands the chorus, a collective of 12 to 15 men who move in rhythmic, haunting unison. They are the ideal spectator, the voice of the city, and the bridge between the myth and the mundane. As the tragedy unfolds, they sing and dance, their voices rising in a choral ode that provides the moral heartbeat of the play. They do not merely watch, they comment, they warn, and they weep. They remind the audience that the king's downfall is not an isolated event, but a fracture in the cosmic order. Through the chorus, your personal grief finds a communal rhythm. Their movements turn the chaotic pain of existence into a structured, beautiful dance. The plays themselves are not entertainments. They are gut-wrenching explorations of the human condition at its most fractured. You watch as a king, blinded by hubris, that fatal, arrogant pride, stumbles into the trap of his own making. You witness the collision of irreconcilable truths, the law of the state versus the law of the gods, the love of a mother versus the duty of a citizen. These stories are populated by murder, madness, and the terrifying realization that the gods are not interested in your happiness, but in your endurance. You see Oedipus tear out his own eyes when the truth becomes too bright to bear. You hear the screams of Medea as she burns the foundations of her own world. This is the theater of tragedy, where the gods use human lives to write lessons in the dirt. You do not come here to see a hero win. You come to see a hero fall with such dignity and resonance that your own small, sun-scorched life feels suddenly, briefly, part of a grander design. As the shadows of the actors lengthen across the stone, a strange phenomenon occurs. 10,000 people, who spent their mornings arguing in the market or scraping dirt from their skin with bronze blades, begin to weep in unison. This is catharsis, the emotional purge. Aristotle would later argue that by experiencing extreme pity and fear in the safety of the theater, the soul is cleansed of these volatile emotions. In a city built on the suppression of the many, the theater is the one place where the scream is permitted. You weep for the fallen king because you are weeping for your own mortality. You tremble at the divine wrath because you know how fragile your own house of mud bricks truly is. The theater acts as a social safety valve, allowing the collective pressure of a brutal existence to escape through the eyes. In this shared agony, the citizen finds a deeper form of equality than the assembly could ever provide, the equality of the broken heart. But the Greeks knew that the soul cannot survive on sorrow alone. After hours of unrelenting tragedy, the atmosphere shifts. The towering heroes vanish, replaced by the sadder play, a lewd, chaotic, and often grotesque comedy featuring half-man, half-goat creatures. It is a jarring, visceral reminder that humans are not only spirits capable of tragedy, but animals driven by appetite. They mock the very gods they just feared. They make light of the heroes whose deaths they just mourned. This is the dark humor of the survivor. It is the ancient world's way of saying that even in the shadow of the grave, the body demands to laugh. It is the necessary bridge back to the world of the barley brick and the diluted wine. A reminder that to be human is to exist in the tension between the sublime and the ridiculous. We must remember that this was not a passive experience. The audience was loud, volatile, and deeply invested. They would hiss at a bad performance, cheer for a powerful line, and occasionally throw olives or stones if the playwright offended their sensibilities. To sit in the theater was to participate in a democratic act as vital as any vote. At the end of the festival, a jury of citizens would vote on the winner, deciding which playwright had most effectively shattered and rebuilt the soul of the city. In the cradle of civilization, the highest honor was not granted to the man who made the most money, but to the man who made the city cry with the most beauty. Is the theater a sanctuary, or is it another form of manipulation? We celebrate these plays as the height of Western art, yet they were performed in a society that kept its women in shadows and its labor in chains. The very humanity explored on the stage was often denied to those who sat in the furthest, cheapest seats. The tragedy was a luxury of the free, a way to process a guilt that many were not yet ready to name. As you look upon the ruins of these theaters today, do not see them as empty monuments. See them as stone lungs that once breathed in the collective sorrow of a people and breathed out the first melodies of Western literature. The tragedy taught the Greeks that while we cannot escape our fate, we can choose how we meet it. We can meet it with a mask of dignity, a song of defiance, and a heart that refuses to be silenced by the gods. The sun finally dips below the horizon, casting the great theater into a cool, violet shadow. The masks are put away, the platform shoes are removed, and the 10,000 citizens begin their slow descent back into the winding alleys of the city. They walk in a rare, heavy silence, their eyes still red from the communal purge. They return to their small windows and their straw-stuffed mattresses, but they are not the same people who arrived at dawn. For a few hours, they were larger than their lives. For a few hours, their suffering had a name and a meter. The masks of the theater have been laid aside, and the echoes of the chorus have faded into the limestone ridges. Yet the catharsis sought in the stone amphitheater was merely a rehearsal for the visceral horror that now descends upon the city. We leave the metaphorical tragedies of the stage behind to confront a drama written not in verse, but in the blackened veins and hollow gazes of the dying. In the ancient world, there is no separation between the heavens and the earth. The air you breathe is a gift from the gods, but it can just as easily become their weapon. As we move from the spiritual purge of the drama to the physical purge of the pestilence, we enter a world where the invisible is more lethal than any Spartan spear, and where the gods have finally decided to speak, not through oracles, but through the silence of the grave. Imagine the year 430 BCE. The city of Athens is a pressure cooker, its walls bulging with refugees fleeing the Spartan scorched earth campaigns of the Peloponnesian War. The atmosphere is thick, a toxic blend of unwashed tunics, the musk of livestock, and the stench of open-air sewers that carve narrow, filth-ridden paths through the overcrowded streets. In this cramped, sun-baked labyrinth, a silent traveler arrives on the salt-laden winds from the east. It begins as a whisper, a fever in the Piraeus, but soon it becomes a roar that drowns out the rhetoric of the assembly. This is not a failure of biology to the ancient mind. It is a manifestation of divine wrath. To the ancients, illness is never random. It is a symptom of a cosmic disturbance, a fracture in the sacred harmony between the mortal realm and the divine. When the plague strikes, the question is not what is the bacteria, but what have we done? Which taboo was broken? Which sacrifice was forgotten? In the ancient world, a cough is an omen, and a fever is a sentence handed down from the peaks of Olympus. The gods of the Greeks are not the benevolent shepherds of later mythologies. They are divine drama queens with superpowers, temperamental titans whose moods shift with the speed of a lightning bolt. You live in a state of perpetual spiritual damage control. You pour wine for Poseidon before a voyage, and offer a goat to Ares before a skirmish. Yet even perfect ritual offers no guarantee of safety. At the center of this pestilence stands Apollo, the god of music, light, and most terrifyingly, the archer of plague. In the epic memory of the Greeks, Apollo's arrows carry the infection, striking down those who have offended the divine order. Perhaps it was a temple statue mocked after too many cups of wine, or a sacred grove stepped upon by the wrong foot. In this worldview, the plague is the breath of the gods, a celestial exhalation that turns the very air into a medium of execution. The gods did not love you. They merely tolerated your existence until the moment your presence became an inconvenience to their divine whims. The Great Plague of Athens, as recorded by the survivor Thucydides, was an apocalypse of the flesh. It did not care for your philosophy, your beauty, or your lineage. It claimed the general and the slave with the same indifferent fury. The symptoms were a descent into a living Hades, internal fires that made the touch of a linen tunic feel like a brand, tongues bleeding in the darkness of the mouth, and a thirst so profound that men threw themselves into communal fountains, drowning in the very water that could not quench their inner furnace. The social fabric, already frayed by the weight of the bronze and the silence of the marginalized, began to unravel completely. When death is certain, and the gods seem to have abandoned the altars, morality becomes a luxury the dying cannot afford. The laws of men and the laws of the gods were ignored as the city became a landscape of unburied corpses, a spiritual catastrophe for a people who believed that an unburied soul was doomed to wander eternally between worlds. The glory of Greece was reduced to the sight of funeral pyres lighting the night sky, their smoke carrying the scent of a civilization burning from the inside out. In the face of this divine onslaught, the primitive medicine of the era stood paralyzed. The physicians, following the teachings of Hippocrates, desperately sought to restore the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed the plague was an excess of heat or a corruption of the fluids, prescribing boiled cabbage water, vinegar compresses, or the draining of blood to vent the poison. But the humors remained stubbornly unbalanced. The herbs and the garlic compresses were no match for the arrows of Apollo. When the rational failed, the people turned back to the mystical. They flocked to the Asclepians, the sacred healing sanctuaries of the god Asclepius. They underwent rituals of purification, fasting, and prayer, sleeping in sacred dormitories in the hope that a divine dream or the touch of a sacred snake would grant them a reprieve. They were caught between a medicine that didn't work and a religion that was killing them, a desperate population clutching at the hem of gods who had already turned their backs. The most harrowing casualty of the plague was not the body, but the soul of the city. As Thucydides observed, the plague brought about a lawlessness, that the assembly could not legislate away. If the pious died alongside the wicked, then what was the value of virtue? If the temples were filled with the corpses of those who sought sanctuary, then the gods were either powerless or malicious. This was the ultimate illusion of liberty. The citizen was free to speak in the assembly, but he was not free from the mosquito or the moldy figure. The democracy that claimed to empower the individual was revealed to be a fragile cage, easily shattered by a microscopic traveler. The plague was a visceral reminder that the unexamined life was often cut short before the examination could even begin. The plague would eventually burn itself out, leaving Athens a hollowed-out version of its former self, its population decimated, and its golden age tarnished by the soot of the pyres. 1 in 3 children would never see adulthood, a staggering statistic of loss that defined the ancient psyche. But the memory of the divine wrath would remain etched into the Western soul. It taught the Greeks that the universe was not a clockwork machine, but a temperamental theater where the gods held the script. We look back and see a world of logic and marble, but they lived in a world of fear and fire. They knew that survival was a temporary truce, and that health was merely the absence of a god's attention. The plague was the final chorus in the tragedy of the ancient world, a reminder that while man may build temples that reach for the sun, he remains a creature of the dust, subject to the breath of powers he can neither name nor appease. The fires of the pyres eventually fade, leaving only the white ash of memory. The city attempts to rebuild, to return to the barley bread and the debates of the agora. But the air is different now. It carries the metallic tang of the grave and the lingering suspicion that the gods are still watching, their bows perpetually drawn. The individual has been humbled, and the state has been shaken. But as the physical wounds begin to scar, a new kind of struggle emerges, one that is fought not with prayers or humors, but with the raw, unyielding will to endure. The funeral pyres of Athens have long since crumbled into gray ash, and the divine wrath that scorched the Mediterranean has settled into the silent archives of history. But the shadow of the eagle does not rest. It stretches, cold and relentless, across the jagged spine of Europe, reaching for the mist-choked edges of the known world. We leave behind the marble symmetry of the south and descend into the damp, primordial forests of the north, to a land where the sun is a fleeting ghost and the earth breathes with the ancient pulse of the Celts. Here, in the province of Britannia, the Roman machine seeks to tame the wild through the illusion of law. But as we shall see, an empire's promise is often a shroud in waiting. The tragedy of Greece was written by the gods. The tragedy of Britain would be written by the cold, calculating hand of men, who forgot that a broken spirit is the most dangerous spark of all. In the eastern reaches of this island, where the fens meet the gray Atlantic, lived the Iceni, a tribe of horsemen and warriors who existed in a fragile, gilded truce with the Roman occupier. At their head sat Prasutagus, a king who had mastered the art of the client, a man who walked a tightrope between ancestral pride and imperial submission. For years, he provided Rome with wealth and stability, and in return, Rome allowed him the ghost of autonomy. His kingdom flourished under the shadow of the eagle, a sanctuary of peace in a land of shifting allegiances. But Prasutagus was a man who understood the fleeting nature of life in the path of a titan. He knew that when he fell, the sanctuary he built would be as vulnerable as a bird's nest in a winter storm. As his final hour approached, around the year 60 AD, the king sought to craft a legacy that would shield his house from the voracious hunger of the empire. He did not reach for his sword, he reached for the stylus. In a gesture of desperate loyalty, he drafted a will, a legal prayer etched in parchment. He named the Roman emperor, the distant and mercurial Nero, as the co-heir to his vast estates, alongside his 2 young daughters. It was a masterpiece of diplomacy, a calculated sacrifice meant to ensure that by giving Rome half, his family might keep the rest. He believed in the sanctity of the Roman contract. He believed that the law was a shield. He was wrong. When the breath finally left Prasutagus, the ink on his will was not yet dry before the mask of Roman friendship was cast aside. To the administrators in Londinium and the soldiers in the field, a dead client king was not a partner to be honored, but a carcass to be picked clean. The Roman authorities did not negotiate, they annexed. The Iceni kingdom, once a sovereign ally, was treated as conquered territory, a prize of war seized without a single spear being thrown in return. Imagine the scene: Roman legionaries, their iron armor clattering like the scales of a serpent, storming into the ancestral halls of the Iceni. They did not come with scrolls of law, they came with torches and chains. They seized the lands, the livestock, and the very homes of the tribal elite, treating the nobles of Britain like common slaves. The wealth that Prasutagus had carefully guarded for his daughters was vanished into the imperial coffers, and the dignity of his people was ground into the mud of their own fields. The will was not a protection, it was a map for the plunderers. But the theft of gold and land was merely the prologue to a deeper, more visceral infamy. At the center of this storm stood Boudica, the widow of the king, a woman whose name meant victory, yet who now stood in the wreckage of her world. The Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, sought not just to dispossess the Iceni, but to break their spirit, to ensure that no spark of resistance could ever flicker in the damp British air. He chose a path of psychological warfare that would haunt the annals of Rome forever. In a public display of calculated brutality, Queen Boudica was stripped and flogged. The lash did not just tear her skin, it tore the social fabric of the tribes. To the Celts, the person of the monarch was sacred, a link between the people and the land. To see their queen treated like a rebellious slave was an insult that transcended politics. It was a desecration of the soul. But the Romans, in their arrogance, were not finished. They turned their attention to the two daughters, the girls whom Prasutagus had died trying to protect, and violated them in a manner so heinous it remains a dark stain on the history of the occupation. Rome believed it had delivered a finishing blow. They believed that by shaming the mother and destroying the children, they had turned the Iceni into a broken, compliant flock. They viewed Boudica as a minor tribal woman, a nuisance to be brushed aside by the weight of the legion. They failed to realize that they had not crushed a woman, they had awakened a lioness. Boudica did not scream, she did not plead. In the cold, post-flogging silence, a transformation occurred that would reshape the destiny of the province. The grief of the mother and the shame of the queen were forged into a single, unyielding blade of vengeance. She looked upon her wounded daughters and her plundered lands, and she saw a truth that no Roman philosopher had ever dared to write, that an empire built on the violation of the innocent has already begun to rot from within. What is justice in the shadow of the eagle? We speak of Roman law, the Pax Romana, and the civilizing mission of the Mediterranean. Yet here, on the edges of the world, that law is revealed to be nothing more than a thin veil for greed. The will of a king was a scrap of paper against the will of an army. The betrayal of the Iceni exposes the fundamental hypocrisy of conquest, that the peace offered by the victor is only a temporary pause in the violence of the powerful. For the Iceni, the unexamined life was no longer possible. They were faced with a choice: to die slowly in the silence of their chains, or to set the world on fire and find their dignity in the embers. The Romans had broken a treaty, they had broken a family, and in doing so, they had broken the illusion of their own invincibility. They had taught the tribes that the only language Rome truly respected was the language of blood and iron. Word of the atrocity spread through the mist like a contagion. Other tribes, the Trinovants, the Corioltavi, listened to the stories of the flogged queen and the violated daughters, and they felt the stirring of their own forgotten rage. They remembered their own humiliations, their own stolen sons, and their own gods mocked by the marble temples of the occupier. The spark ignited in the Iceni heartland was beginning to find fuel in the vast, resentful landscape of Britannia. Boudica stood at the center of this gathering storm, her red hair a war flag against the gray sky, her voice no longer a whisper of mourning, but a clarion call for resurrection. She was no longer just a widow. She was the spearhead of a holy mission to cleanse the land of Roman arrogance. The empire had underestimated the power of a mother with nothing left to lose, and soon, the cities of the south would feel the heat of a fire that no legion could extinguish. The Roman soldiers returned to their garrisons, satisfied with their plunder, unaware that the silence they had created was not the silence of peace, but the silence before a landslide. The will of Prasutagus lay in the mud, its promises broken, but a new will was being written in the secret groves and moonlit hills of Britain, a will of fire, of steel, and of a vengeance that would make even the emperor in Rome tremble. The betrayal was complete, but the revolt was only just beginning. The Roman lash has fallen silent, and the soldiers have retreated to their garrisons, satisfied that they have extinguished the spirit of the Iceni along with the dignity of their queen. They believe that in the damp, heavy silence of the British mist, a flogged woman and her violated daughters are merely a footnote to imperial expansion, a broken family in a broken land. But as the moon rises over the jagged edges of the fens, that silence begins to change. It is no longer the silence of submission. It is the silence of a void being filled with a primal, terrifying heat. The empire believed it had crushed a minor tribal widow beneath its iron-soled boot, but in their arrogance, they forgot that the most dangerous weapon in existence is a mother with nothing left to lose. Imagine her standing at the edge of a sacred grove, the gray Atlantic wind whipping through the ancient oaks. Boudica was not born to obey. She was born to lead, a woman described by even her enemies as a force of nature. She stands tall, her presence commanding the very air around her. Her flaming red hair, a cascade of fire reaching down to her waist, acts as a living banner against the overcast sky. Her voice, which once spoke the soft language of diplomacy and the whispers of a mother's lullaby, has been forged in the furnace of humiliation. It has become a war horn, a sound that does not merely reach the ear, but slices through the spirit of anyone who hears it. She is no longer the wife of a client king. She is the physical embodiment of the land's own fury. In her eyes, there is a gaze that looks through the Roman eagle and into the very heart of the sun. The scars on her back are not marks of shame. They are a new kind of scripture, a map of vengeance that the tribes of Britannia are finally ready to read. This is the moment the lioness awakens, transforming her personal agony into a holy mandate. Boudica understood a truth that the Roman administrators, in their obsession with taxes and ledgers, had completely ignored. Rome's greatest fear was not an army, but unity. For generations, the tribes of Britain had been a fractured mosaic of rivalries and old grudges, easily manipulated and systematically exploited. But in the wake of the atrocity committed against the Iceni royal house, the queen began to weave these broken shards into a single, lethal blade. She traveled through the mist-shrouded valleys and the moonlit hills, visiting the secret gatherings of the oppressed. First came the Trinovants, a people who had once been powerful, but were now ground into the dirt by Roman land seizures and forced labor. When Boudica spoke to them, she did not speak like a politician. She spoke like a warrior mother, scarred but unbroken. She did not promise them safety or the return of their gold. She promised them the one thing more valuable than life itself, the right to die as free men and women. The fire spread. The Corialtavi, the Cornovii, and even elements of the distant Brigantes began to stir. In the sacred groves, under the watchful eyes of the Druids, who saw omens of blood in the shifting clouds, the warriors gathered. This was not merely a political rebellion. It was a resurrection of Celtic identity. Farmers abandoned their plows to take up spears. Hunters refined their skills for the hunt of men. Even the women, inspired by a queen who rode among them rather than behind them, took up arms, preparing to fight for a future where their children would not be property. Boudica stood in the dirt with them, her chariot a pulpit of war. She listened to the elders' sorrow and the young men's rage, and she gave it a name. She summoned the gods, not the distant, marble-clad deities of the Mediterranean, but the visceral, earthy powers of the island. She called upon Andraste, the Celtic goddess of war and victory, inviting the divine to witness the justice she was about to carve out of Roman flesh. She told them that the land itself was screaming, and that the gods would fight in the front ranks of their lines. What is the nature of a queen who leads from the wreckage of her own life? The ancient world offers us many conquerors, but few like Boudica. She had no formal military training, no scrolls of Roman strategy, and no legionary discipline. She had only righteous fury, a sharpened, crystalline purpose that transformed tens of thousands of disparate people into a single, devastating storm. This transformation asks a profound question of history. Can an empire ever truly own a land if it cannot own the souls of its mothers? Rome believed that power was a matter of iron and coin, but Boudica proved that power is also a matter of memory. Every name she called out, the names of the raped, the enslaved, the executed, was a strike against the Roman illusion of invincibility. She was teaching her people that while Rome could take their land, it could only take their dignity if they remained silent. The army that now swelled around the queen was a terrifying spectacle. It was a sea of wild hair, war paint, and ancient battle chants, a force that did not fight for pay, but for the very right to exist. They were the unexamined lives of the North, the people Rome viewed as barbarians, now marching toward the centers of civilization with torches in their hands. Boudica looked toward the south, toward the Roman colonies of Camulodunum and Londinium, cities built on sacred British soil and filled with the arrogant monuments of the occupier. She did not see centers of culture, she saw targets. She knew that to truly strike at the heart of the empire, she had to burn the symbols of its pride. She vowed that there would be no surrender and no turning back. The lioness had found her roar, and the storm was no longer building, it was ready to break. The night before the first march, the air in the British camp is electric, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of sharpening blades. Boudica stands alone for a moment, looking at the two daughters she has sworn to avenge. The scars on her back throb with the cold, but she no longer feels the pain. She only feels the heat of the mission. Tomorrow, the Roman eagle will encounter the British raven. Tomorrow, the blood of the violated will be the ink that rewrites the history of Britannia. The lioness has ceased her roar, for the time of words has vanished into the rising smoke of the Iceni camp. The gathering storm we witnessed in the sacred groves has finally broken its banks, no longer a collection of grievances, but a tidal wave of iron and ancestral fury. As the gray mists of Britannia are stained with the flickering orange of 1,000 torches, we move from the silent preparation of the queen to the screaming reality of the revolt. The Roman eagle, which for 17 years looked down upon this island with a cold, predatory gaze, now finds itself blinded by the soot of its own burning colonies. We descend now into the heart of the fire, to the moment when the eternal cities of the empire became funeral pyres for the arrogance of Rome. Imagine the city of Camulodunum, once a proud British stronghold, now transformed into a sprawling Roman colony, a place of tiled roofs, villas, and the heavy, rhythmic gait of the veteran soldier. But at the center of this urban artifice stands the ultimate provocation, the Temple of Claudius. To the Roman, it is a monument to civilization. To the Briton, it is a marble mockery built with the blood and sweat of the enslaved, a shrine to the very man who chained their ancestors. When Boudica's army arrived, they did not come as a disciplined legion, but as a force of nature. Camulodunum, in its imperial vanity, had no walls. The Romans had grown complacent, believing that the mere shadow of their name was enough to keep the barbarians at bay. They were wrong. The tribes descended like a landslide of war paint and steel. The streets, once the theater of Latin law, became an execution ground where the veterans who had bullied the Iceni were hunted through their own gardens. The Temple of Claudius became the final, suffocating sanctuary. Those who survived the initial slaughter barricaded themselves behind its massive bronze doors, believing that the stones of their god would protect them. For 2 days, they listened to the rhythmic thud of axes and the chants of a queen who had forgotten how to show mercy. When the doors finally breached, the temple did not offer salvation, it offered a firestorm. The roof collapsed in a roar of flame that could be seen for miles, signaling to the rest of the island that the Eternal was, in fact, incredibly flammable. As Camuloginum cooled into a landscape of white ash, the queen did not pause to celebrate. Vengeance is a hunger that grows as it feeds. The army, now swollen to tens of thousands by the success of the first massacre, turned its gaze toward the south, toward the jewel of Roman Britannia, Londinium. This was no longer just a tribal uprising, it was a resurrection of a lost world. Farmers who had spent their lives bowing to Roman tax collectors now carried spears with the grace of predators. Hunters who once sought deer now tracked the iron-scented trail of the legion. Boudica rode at the front, her chariot a pulpit of fire, her red hair a war flag that promised a cleansing of the land. They marched through the damp forests and the rolling hills, leaving a trail of scorched villas and empty garrisons in their wake. The message was clear: everything the Roman has touched must be returned to the earth. In Londinium, the panic was a physical weight. Founded only 17 years prior, the city had become the beating heart of trade and administration, a place of immense wealth and zero defense. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, having rushed back from the slaughter of the Druids in Wales, arrived just ahead of the storm. He looked upon the sprawling, defenseless hub of commerce and made a decision that history would record as a masterpiece of cold, Roman pragmatism. He abandoned it. He realized his limited force could not hold the city, and so he withdrew, taking with him only those who could keep pace with his soldiers. Imagine the terror of those left behind: the old, the sick, the merchants who believed their gold would buy them safety. They watched as the dust of the Roman columns vanished into the distance, leaving them alone with the approaching sound of the Celtic war horn. Londinium, the pride of the empire, was left to be the next sacrifice at the altar of Boudica's fury. When the tribes swept into Londinium, there were no gates to breach, only a systematic eradication to perform. This was not a battle, it was an apocalypse. The killing was not random, it was a ritual of reversal. The homes of the wealthy were torched, the warehouses of the empire exploded into flame, and the streets ran with a tide of red that matched the sky. Archaeologists today still find the Boudican destruction layer, a thick, dark vein of ash and burnt clay buried beneath the modern streets of London, a permanent scar in the earth left by the Queen's torches. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, some impaled, some burned alive in their own temples, none granted the quarter they had denied the Iceni. As the smoke from the city curled black against the British sky, the empire's pride crumbled into the mud of the Thames. The storm did not stop at the river. Verulamium, a prosperous and Romanized town to the northwest, was the next to feel the heat. Like the cities before it, it was leveled with a terrifying efficiency. By the time the fires of Verulamium reached their zenith, the total death toll of the revolt had surpassed 70,000. The shockwaves reached the very heart of the Mediterranean. In the gilded halls of Rome, the Emperor Nero, a man who believed he ruled the world, was seized by a rare, cold panic. For the first time in the history of the occupation, a Roman emperor seriously considered abandoning Britannia entirely. The barbarians had done the unthinkable. They had made the empire bleed so profusely that it considered retreating into the shadows. What does it mean for a city to vanish in a single afternoon? To the Romans, this was the end of civilization, the triumph of chaos over order. But to Boudica and the united tribes, the fire was a form of prayer. It was the only way to wash the land of the Roman stain, to cauterize the wounds left by the lash and the plow. In the ancient world, justice was not a scroll in a courthouse, it was a flame in the hand. The cities were symbols of a future they never asked for, built on ground that was once sacred to their ancestors. By burning them, they were attempting to reset the clock of history, to return to a time when the only law was the law of the seasons and the only king was the land itself. But as the fires raged, a paradox began to emerge. The very success of the revolt was its undoing. The army was growing too large to feed, the supply lines were thinning, and the Roman machine, though battered, was already beginning to regroup in the dark. The three great cities of the south, Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, are now nothing more than glowing embers under a cold Britannic moon. The tribes celebrate amidst the ruins, drinking the wine of their oppressors and wearing the silks of the dead. They believe they have won. They believe the eagle has been plucked of its feathers and will never fly over their forests again. But in the distance, beyond the smoke and the shadows, Suetonius is waiting. He has found his ground, he has sharpened his steel, and he is preparing for the one thing the tribes have not yet faced, a Roman who has nothing left to lose. The fires of Londinium and Verulamium have finally begun to cool, leaving behind nothing but a landscape of charred timber and a sky choked with the gray, drifting ghosts of a burned empire. The tribes have feasted on the wine of the fallen. They have danced in the ruins of the eternal cities, believing that the Roman eagle has been plucked of its feathers and cast into the sea. But as the Celtic war chants echo across the ash heaps, a different sound begins to emerge from the shadows of the northern forests. Not the chaotic roar of a mob, but the rhythmic, metallic, and terrifyingly precise heartbeat of the Roman war machine. Governor Suetonius Paulinus has stopped retreating. He has found his ground, and the storm of fury is about to meet the unwavering wall of iron. Imagine a narrow defile, a jagged throat of earth bordered by dense, primordial forests and rising hills that strip away the horizon. Here, Suetonius Paulinus, a survivor forged in the fires of the Welsh campaigns, has chosen his final sanctuary. He does not have the numbers. He has barely 10,000 men against an ocean of 200,000. But he has the terrain. He has placed his back to the woods, ensuring that no Briton can slip through the shadows to strike from behind. In front of him lies a vast, open plain, a killing field where the mass of the tribal army will be forced to compress, their numerical advantage turning into a suffocating liability. Suetonius does not pray for a miracle, he calculates a slaughter. On the other side of the field, the horizon is a chaotic sea of movement. Tens of thousands of warriors, painted in the blue of the woad and the red of their own expectations, believe they are marching toward a formality. This is no longer just an army, it is a migration of vengeance. Following the warriors are their families, wives, children, and elders, traveling in a vast semicircle of wagons that they have parked at the rear of the battlefield. They have brought their loved ones to witness the end of Rome and Britain, effectively turning their own families into a wooden wall that leaves no room for retreat. Boudica stands atop her war chariot, flanked by her two daughters, those silent, wounded witnesses to the atrocity that sparked this fire. Her red hair is no longer a banner of hope, but a shroud of destiny. She speaks for the last time, her voice cutting through the damp British air like a war horn. She does not speak of taxes or trade. She speaks of the lash, the violation, and the fundamental right to die free. She calls upon Andraste, the goddess of war, vowing that this day will end in either victory or the grave. The roar that rises from her people is primal, a sound so loud it makes the Roman shields vibrate. Yet across the field, the legions remain as still as statues of bronze and salt. The order is given. The Britons charge, a landslide of muscle and scream. But as they enter the narrow mouth of the defile, the math of the battlefield begins its cruel work. They are packed so tightly they cannot swing their long swords. They are so crowded they are trampling their own kin. Suetonius waits. When the Britons are within range, the sky turns dark. Thousands of Roman pila, heavy armor-piercing spears, are unleashed in a single devastating volley. They don't just kill, they pin shields together, turning the Britons' only defense into a heavy, useless burden. Then the Roman line moves. It is not a charge, but a wedge, a sharp, metallic tooth of iron driving into the soft, unarmored mass of the tribes. The gladius, the short sword of the legion, does not slash. It stabs, finding the gaps in the leather and the gaps in the soul. The Britons, who fought for glory and revenge, now find themselves in a meat grinder of professional efficiency. The Roman soldiers are not men in this moment. They are parts of a machine that knows only the rhythm of the thrust and the step forward. The panic begins to spread like a contagion through the tribal ranks. The warriors turn to flee, but they find their path blocked by the very wagons where their families sit. The witnesses have become an execution wall. In the narrow space between the Roman steel and the British wood, the battle transforms into a massacre. The Romans show no mercy. They do not spare the women. They do not spare the children. They do not even spare the livestock. The field becomes a landscape of red-soaked mud and broken dreams. Tens of thousands of Britons fall in the dust, their cries for freedom silenced by the cold, indifferent discipline of the Mediterranean conqueror. When the dust finally settles, the queen is gone. The Roman search parties roam the field, looking for the red-haired martyr, but they find only the dead. Boudica has cheated the empire of its final triumph. She will not be led in chains through the streets of Rome. She will not be a trophy for the Emperor Nero. Some say she took poison, choosing the silence of the grave over the humiliation of the cage. Others believe she vanished into the mist of the fens, returning to the earth from which her fury was born. Whatever her end, her physical death was the moment her legend became immortal. What was won in that final defile? Rome had preserved its province, but it had lost its soul. The peace of Rome was revealed to be a piece of the graveyard, a civilization built on the systematic eradication of the defiant. We look back at this battle as a clash of cultures, but it was also a clash of human natures. The raw, chaotic passion of the individual versus the cold, geometric discipline of the state. Boudica was not a general. She was a symptom, a reaction to an empire that forgot that the most dangerous thing in the world is a mother whom you have left with nothing to love but her vengeance. She lost the battle, but she won the memory. In the cradle of civilization, we celebrate the logic of the legions, but in our hearts, we still hear the scream of the queen in the fire. The Roman soldiers wipe the blood from their bronze greaves and begin the long, tedious work of rebuilding the cities they allowed to burn. The island of Britannia remains a province of the eagle, but the ground is different now. It is salted with the blood of the Iceni and the ash of the Trinovants. The revolt is over, but the silence that follows is not a peace, it is a scar. The roar of the legions has subsided, replaced by a silence so heavy it seems to press the very breath back into the blood-soaked earth. The narrow defile, once a theater of fury and iron, is now a graveyard of dreams, where the ash of the Trinovants and the salt of the Iceni mingle with the indifferent mud of Britannia. The Great Rebellion has been cauterized by Roman steel, yet as the smoke of the final massacre drifts toward the gray horizon, a new and more enduring phenomenon begins to stir. The empire has reclaimed its province, but it has failed to capture the soul of the storm. As we move from the visceral slaughter of the battlefield to the ethereal corridors of memory, we witness the moment where history ends and the eternal myth begins. Boudica has ceased to be a woman of flesh. She is becoming the mist itself. In the cold, calculating aftermath of the victory, the Roman search parties roam the field with a singular, hungry purpose. They seek the prize that would make their triumph complete, the body of the queen. They desire a trophy to lead in chains through the streets of Rome. a broken monarch to parade beneath the triumphal arches of Nero, proving to the world that even the most ferocious barbarian can be tamed by the eagle. But the search yields only silence. The accounts of the victors are fractured and contradictory. Whispers of poison taken in the shadows of a sacred grove, or of a sudden, quiet illness that claimed her spirit in the wake of the defeat. There is no chained queen, no public execution, no final humiliation. In the ancient world, to vanish without a trace is to cheat the victor of their final satisfaction. By refusing to be a corpse for the empire, Boudica becomes a ghost that can never be truly exorcised. She simply disappears, like a storm that has burned itself out, leaving the Romans to realize that while they have conquered the land, the queen has escaped into the sanctuary of the unknown. While Rome sought to bury the memory of their humiliation beneath new temples and paved roads, the tribes of the north began to weave a different narrative. In the secret groves and the moonlit valleys where the Roman law did not reach, the queen did not die. She was resurrected. To the survivors, she was no longer a defeated rebel, but a martyr, a goddess of war and vengeance who had looked into the eyes of the sun and refused to blink. The scars on her back, once intended to shame her, were transformed into a sacred script of resistance. The mothers of the Iceni spoke her name to their children in the dark, turning her story into a lullaby of defiance. They remembered not the slaughter at the defile, but the fires of Londinium. They remembered not the Roman wedge, but the queen who rode at the front of the line with her daughters by her side. In this collective memory, Boudica became a symbol of an unbreakable will, a reminder that there is a dignity that rises even from total devastation. She was the proof that the silenced could rise, and that an empire's invincibility is only as strong as the fear it can command. Even the Romans, in their rigid obsession with order, found themselves haunted by her resonance. The historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio, writing from the safety of a later century, could not help but color their accounts with a reluctant, shimmering respect. They described her not as a mere barbarian, but as a formidable leader, a woman of commanding presence and terrifying speech, who had been deeply wronged by the very empire they served. To Tacitus, she was a mirror held up to Roman arrogance, a visceral warning of what happens when a conqueror forgets the humanity of the conquered. In their records, she is depicted as a lioness, a figure of mythic proportions whose red hair and war-horn voice seem to vibrate through the Latin prose. By writing her story, the Romans inadvertently granted her the very immortality they had tried to deny her on the battlefield. They made her a character in the grand tragedy of the human condition, a woman who had dared to strike back against the tide of destiny. For centuries, the story of the queen lay dormant, buried beneath the layers of ash and the shifting boundaries of subsequent empires. But history has a way of breathing again when the time is right. In the Victorian era, as a different empire sought to understand its own identity, the ghost of Boudica was summoned from the British mist. The irony was profound. The island that had once been a victim of imperial expansion now celebrated the queen who had fought against it. She was reimagined not as a tribal rebel, but as a national hero. Tennyson sang of her fury, and her image was forged in bronze near Westminster Bridge. Standing tall on a war chariot, her daughters at her side, her eyes fixed eternally on the horizon. This statue is more than art. It is a manifestation of the enduring power of the myth. Below her, the modern world hums with a technology she could never have imagined, yet she remains a sentinel, a permanent reminder that the spirit of rebellion is a fundamental part of the landscape. She is the eternal question asked of every ruler: what happens when the silenced rise? What is the legacy of a woman who lost everything, yet refuses to be forgotten? Boudica's rebellion was marked by massacres and blood, a war that was rarely clean and never gentle. But history is not carved by saints, it is etched by those who dare to resist. Her legend does not endure because she was perfect, but because she was honest in her agony and unyielding in her purpose. She teaches us that memory is the final battlefield. Rome could redraw the maps and rebuild the cities, but they could not erase the fire she had lit in the human imagination. Her flame burns in every soul that has ever stood against oppression and whispered, "I will not kneel." The vanishing into the mist was not an end, but a transition, from a leader of tribes to a leader of the human spirit. She remains the queen who made the empire bleed, the warrior who taught the world that a soul in defiance of the world can never truly be conquered. The mist continues to swirl over the British fens, cold and indifferent to the passing of ages. The bronze statue at Westminster grows dark with the patina of time, yet the eyes of the queen still seem to hold the heat of the fire she once carried. She is gone, yet she is everywhere, in the wind that screams through the oaks, in the fire that flickers in the hearth, and in the stubborn resilience of a land that has seen empires rise and fall while its own heart remains unbroken. The myth is born, and it will never die. The mists of Britannia have swallowed the legend of the warrior queen, leaving behind a landscape scarred by the iron will of empires and the stubborn resilience of myth. But as we drift away from the blood-soaked soil of the north, we find ourselves entering a different kind of battlefield, one that is fought within the silent, microscopic corridors of the human frame. The roar of the phalanx and the crackle of burning cities are replaced by the rhythmic, heavy pulse of a fevered heart and the quiet, desperate breathing of the mortal. In the ancient world, the body was not a machine of flesh and bone to be repaired by logic alone. It was a fragile mirror of the universe itself. To follow was not merely a biological failure, but a cosmic fracture, a sign that the delicate thread connecting the individual to the stars had begun to unravel. We step now into the moonlit chambers of the first healers, where medicine was born not from the laboratory, but from a profound, terrifying attempt to restore the balance of the world. Imagine a world where a cough is not a symptom of a virus, but a whisper from a neglected god. In the ancient mind, health was a state of grace, a precarious harmony between the seen and the unseen. When that harmony was disrupted, the result was a deeper disturbance that no amount of mere rest could soothe. In the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the diagnosis began not with the pulse, but with a question of morality. What have you done? Who have you angered? Disease was a manifestation of divine judgment or the lingering shadow of a curse. The healer was an interpreter of omens, a reader of entrails and clay tablets who sought to understand which celestial law had been violated. To be sick was to be out of step with the divine rhythm, a spiritual exile that required rituals, spells, and incantations to bridge the gap between the suffering mortal and the indifferent heavens. In this realm of shadows, the priest and the physician were one, wielding the word and the herb as twin blades against the darkness. As we travel further east, the concept of healing shifts from divine punishment to the manipulation of a primordial, invisible energy. In ancient China, the body was seen as an intricate map of rivers and valleys through which the qi, the vital life force, flowed like a celestial wind. To the Chinese physician, health was the perfect, dynamic dance between yin and yang, the cool and the hot, the dark and the light, the internal and the external. When the qi became blocked, or when one force devoured the other, the body would scream in the language of pain. The physician did not look for a cure in a bottle. They looked for a way to rebalance the inner cosmos. They observed the turning of the seasons, the phases of the moon, and the behavior of the elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, to find the root of the discord. Healing was an art of restoration, a slow, meditative process of unblocking the meridians and inviting the energy of the universe to return to its natural, fluid state. Here, the unexamined life was not just a philosophical tragedy, but a medical one. To ignore the rhythms of nature was to invite the chaos of the grave. In the vibrant, spice-scented valleys of ancient India, a similar wisdom was being carved into the very soul of the culture. Ayurveda, the science of life, viewed the human being not as a separate entity, but as a direct reflection of the five great elements. Everyone was born with a unique thumbprint of energy, a balance of the three dashas: Veda, the wind of movement; Pitta, the fire of transformation; and Kapha, the earth of stability. Illness was the sound of these forces colliding in the dark. A fever was not an enemy to be defeated, but a fire that had escaped its hearth. A lethargy was an earth that had become too heavy for the spirit to carry. The Ayurvedic healer was a gardener of the soul, using herbs like ashwagandha and turmeric, along with oil massages and meditative fasting, to return the individual to their primordial equilibrium. They understood that to treat the body without treating the mind and the spirit was like trying to fix a broken branch while ignoring the rot in the roots. In this ancient tradition, we are not just living in nature, we are nature, and when we fall ill, it is the earth's own call for us to return to our center. Back in the marble-clad hills of Greece, a revolution of thought was beginning to stir in the temples of Asclepius. While the common man still feared the arrows of Apollo, a new breed of thinker, led by the shadow of Hippocrates, began to seek the rational within the miraculous. They rejected the idea that the gods spent their days smiting mortals with fevers, looking instead to the physical world, to the seasons, the winds, and the water, to find the causes of suffering. This was the birth of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To the Greek physician, the body was a vessel of these four fluids, each linked to a temperament and an element of the earth. A healthy person was a person in a state of eucrasia, a perfect blending of these humors. Disease was simply a leak or an overflow, a corruption of the internal ecosystem that required bloodletting, purging, or strict dietary adjustments to restore the balance. Though we look back and see the boiled cabbage water of their prescriptions as primitive, the philosophy behind it was profound. For the first time, the human body was seen as a system that could be known, understood, and brought back into harmony through reason. What does it mean to live in a world where your health is tied to the movement of the stars and the balance of the elements? The ancient world offered no quick fixes. It offered only the heavy responsibility of wholeness. Every culture, despite its distance and its language, arrived at the same haunting conclusion: that the human being is a fragile inhabitant of a vast, interconnected web. When we lost our balance, we lost our place in the world. The unseen forces the ancients feared were not just ghosts or demons, but the very real consequences of living out of harmony with our environment and our own nature. They understood that to heal was not just to survive, but to remember who we are, to reconnect the shattered fragments of our existence and find our rhythm within the grand, indifferent music of the cosmos. The shadows of the healing temples grow long as the sun dips below the horizon, and the incense of the rituals mingles with the scent of crushed herbs and ancient dust. The individual, caught between the logic of the humor and the magic of the prayer, waits in the darkness for the balance to return. The foundations of healing have been laid, built not on the certainty of the machine, but on the mystery of the spirit. But as the mind begins to master the invisible forces, the hand begins to reach for the tool. The era of the philosopher is yielding to the era of the practitioner. The incense of the healing temples has drifted away, leaving behind the sterile, iron-scented reality of the physical body. We have contemplated the cosmic balance and the dance of the humors, but there are moments when philosophy is not enough, when the spirit's discord manifests as a rot in the flesh that no prayer can reach. In these dark hours, the ancient world sets aside the herb and the incantation to reach for the cold, unyielding precision of the blade. We move now from the mystical halls of the Asclepian to the blood-stained tables of the SW&W and the battlefield surgeons of the legions. Here, in the flickering lamplight of Alexandria and Rome, medicine becomes an act of violent mercy, a desperate, high-stakes gamble where the line between the sacred intermediary and the artist of the blade is written in blood. In the shadow of the pyramids, the Egyptian healers, known as the SWNW, do not view the body as a mere machine, but as a vessel entwined with the divine. To them, surgery is both a science and a sorcery, an advanced craft governed by the wisdom of the Ebers Papyrus. Imagine a physician in the court of a pharaoh, his copper tools glowing red in the heat of a ceremonial fire. Sterilization born not of a germ theory, but of a ritual necessity for purity. These masters of the Nile do not merely set fractures. They perform delicate maneuvers that defy the limitations of their era. They drain abscesses and treat tumors with a terrifyingly calm precision, using fire to cauterize the wounds they have opened. They possess a profound understanding of the invisible battle against infection, applying moldy bread, a primitive, accidental antibiotic, to the wounds of the suffering. In the land of the pharaohs, the surgeon's hand is guided by Thoth, the god of wisdom, and every cut is accompanied by incantations meant to bind the soul to the flesh even as the body is flayed open. While the West looked to the Nile, a revolutionary spirit was carving a different path in the valleys of India. Here stands Sushruta, the father of surgery, a man who viewed the human form with a level of anatomical detail that would not be surpassed for a millennium. In his hands, the scalpel is not a weapon of trauma, but a tool of reconstruction. Imagine the technical marvel of the ancient rhinoplasty, reconstructing a mutilated face using a flap of skin from the cheek or forehead. His toolkit, comprised of over 120 surgical instruments, from forceps to probes, represents the pinnacle of ancient engineering, tools designed to navigate the labyrinth of human anatomy with a precision that borders on the divine. Sushruta teaches the world that a surgeon must be a scientist of the spirit and an artist of the bone, emphasizing a hygiene that was centuries ahead of its time. As we travel to the heart of the Roman Empire, the surgical theater shifts from the temple to the amphitheater and the blood-soaked mud of the frontier. Here, the physician Galen hones his craft not on scrolls, but on the torn sinews of fallen gladiators and the shattered limbs of legionaries. In Rome, surgery is a visceral, utilitarian necessity. The tools of the Roman surgeon are instruments of iron and bone, designed for the bitter necessity of the battlefield. There is no anesthesia here to soften the blow. There is only a leather strap for the patient to bite down on as the bone saw begins its rhythmic, agonizing work. Every procedure is a race against the dual shadows of sepsis and shock. Yet, through the dissection of animals and the grim opportunities provided by the arena, Galen maps the nervous and vascular systems, creating an anatomical gospel that will rule the Western mind for 1,500 years. Perhaps the most haunting testament to the ancient surgeon's skill is the practice of trepation, the act of cutting a hole directly into the living skull to relieve the pressure of the spirit or the blood. Archaeologists uncover these skulls across the world, from Egypt to Peru, finding evidence of bone regeneration that proves the impossible. The patient survived. In some regions, the survival rate for this radical intrusion into the brain's sanctuary exceeded 80%, a miracle of survival achieved with nothing more than cocoa leaves, fermented beer, and a steady hand. It is a visceral reminder that even in the absence of modern technology, the human will to heal and to endure knows no boundaries. What does it mean to be the one who must cut into life itself to preserve it? The ancient surgeon lived in a state of perpetual existential tension. They were the masters of life through pain, individuals who understood that sometimes the only way to save the whole is to sacrifice the part. They operated in a world where a simple cut could be a death sentence, and where every success was a direct theft from the gods. This was the artist of the blade, men and women who carried the weight of their patients' screams into the night, relying on a blend of herbs, hope, and sheer resilience. They remind us that the history of medicine is not a clean progression of discoveries, but a jagged, blood-stained odyssey of courage. They were the ones who dared to touch the sacred interior of the human frame, proving that while our bodies are fragile and mortal, our capacity to intervene in our own destiny is limitless. The surgeon wipes the blood from his bronze tools, the patient's breathing finally steadying in the cool evening air. The Nestor is laid aside, but the struggle against the fragility of the flesh continues. In the ancient world, we have mastered the blade and the balance, but there are deeper wounds that no metal can touch, wounds of the heart and the memory. The iron scent of the surgical table has faded, and the screams of the operating theater have been swallowed by a deeper, more intentional silence. We have witnessed the mastery of the Egyptian SWNW and the cold, pragmatic efficiency of the Roman legionary surgeon. Yet as the blood is washed from the bronze blades, a haunting truth remains. The body may be mended, but the spirit often remains in exile. In the ancient world, the Nestor was the last resort, for it could only touch the flesh. To truly reach the source of suffering, one had to look beyond the visible wound and into the invisible tapestry of the soul. We move now from the visceral reality of the blade to the ethereal realm of the ritual, a world where healing is not a mechanical repair, but a sacred homecoming. Imagine a world where you are never truly alone in your illness. To the ancients, health was not merely the absence of pain, it was the presence of harmony, a state of grace where the individual, the community, and the land itself breathed in a single, synchronized rhythm. When that rhythm was broken, the result was a deeper disturbance, a fracture in the cosmic order that required more than herbs or logic to repair. Healing was a quest for reconnection, a journey back to the primordial center where the human spirit was forged from the same dust and starlight as the mountains and the sea. In this sacred landscape, the healer was not a technician, but a spiritual guide, a storyteller, and a keeper of ancestral memory. Whether in the dense forests of the Americas or the sun-bleached valleys of Africa, medicine was a way of life, woven into the very fabric of daily existence through the power of the symbolic act. Follow the scent of burning sage and cedar as it curls through the quiet air of a tribal camp. In the indigenous traditions of the Americas, the ritual began with the smoke. This was the smudging, a ceremonial cleansing designed to wash away the gray residue of trauma and invite the golden light of the spirits to return. The medicine man or woman did not begin by asking where it hurt, but by seeking where the soul had wandered. They believed in soul loss, the idea that under the weight of fear or grief, a part of the human essence could flee the body, leaving it hollow and susceptible to decay. To heal was to perform a soul retrieval, a journey into the spirit realm fueled by the rhythmic, hypnotic heartbeat of the drum. The ritual was a bridge, through chant, dance, and the focused intention of the community. The healer would call the scattered fragments of the spirit back home. It was a reminder that you were not a broken machine, but a sacred part of a landscape that refused to let you go. Travel now to the clay-walled cities of Mesopotamia, where the night was filled with the whispers of malevolent spirits and the lingering shadows of forgotten taboos. Here, illness was a manifestation of divine judgment or a curse caught in the crosswinds of a cosmic war. The healer was an exorcist, a reader of omens who sought to understand which ancient law had been violated. The ritual was a theater of war. Clay figurines were buried beneath the thresholds of homes to ward off the breath of the plague, and ancient incantations were whispered over poultices of honey and oil. These were not empty words. They were medicine in sound form, designed to restructure the air around the patient and command the darkness to retreat. In the ancient East, to heal was to re-establish the ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and divine harmony, restoring the individual to their rightful place in a world governed by the gods. In the marble-clad hills of Greece, the search for ritual healing reached its most sophisticated form in the Asclepians, the sacred sanctuaries of the god Asclepius. These were not hospitals, but spiritual retreats where the logic of the physician walked hand in hand with the mystery of the dream. The ritual of the Asclepian was a slow, deliberate purification. The patient would undergo days of fasting, ritual bathing, and prayer until the noise of the mundane world was silenced. Then came the encoemesis, the sacred sleep. In a darkened dormitory, surrounded by the statues of the god and the silent, shimmering movements of sacred snakes, the patient waited for a healing dream. They believed that in the stillness of the night, the god would visit them, offering a vision or a touch that would dissolve the roots of their suffering. When they woke, the temple priests would interpret these dreams, translating the language of the unconscious into a prescription for life. In the Greek sanctuary, the mind was the primary laboratory, and belief was the most potent catalyst. Listen now to the distant, driving pulse of the drum in the valleys of sub-Saharan Africa. Here, the sangoma or the nana used rhythm as a scalpel to cut through the isolation of disease. To these healers, the body was a resonant chamber, and illness was a discord that could only be resolved through movement and collective trance. The ritual was an invitation to the ancestors. Through relentless drumming and communal dancing, the healer would enter a state of expanded consciousness, traveling to the spiritual realm to negotiate for the patient's life. They understood that a patient who was disconnected from their ancestors was like a tree disconnected from its roots, destined to wither in the sun of the present. The healing ritual was a social alchemy, transforming the fear of the individual into the hope of the tribe, ensuring that no soul had to face the shadow alone. We often look back on these rituals as superstition or primitive folklore, but we must confront the staggering reality of their success. Modern science speaks of the placebo effect, the power of belief to trigger the body's own internal pharmacy. But the ancients did not need data to understand that the mind and the body are one. Ritual was not a denial of biology, it was a structure given to pain. It provided a language for the unspeakable, a frame for the chaotic, and a sense that suffering had meaning. In a world where mortality was constant and medicine was limited, the ritual was the ultimate safety net. It transformed a solitary, terrifying descent into death into a shared, courageous act of transformation. It taught the ancients that while the body might fail, the dignity of the soul was indestructible as long as the ritual was maintained. As we stand in the modern world of robotic precision and genetic mapping, the whispers of the ancient rituals still haunt our corridors. We see it in the hushed tones of a waiting room, in the symbolic wearing of the white coat, and in the rituals of our own daily self-care. We have mended the bone and conquered the virus, but we still long for the wholeness that only the ritual can provide. The medicine men and women of the past were right. We are not separate from the world. We are the world. When we fall ill, it is a signal that something somewhere is out of harmony. To heal is to listen to the silent energy of the earth, to reconnect with the ancestors, and to remember that we are part of a story that is much larger than our own brief, flickering lives. The incense in the Asclepian has burned to ash, and the echoes of the African drums have faded into the night. The rituals have been completed, and the cosmic balance has been restored, at least for now. The patient rises, not just mended in flesh, but resurrected in spirit, ready to return to the world of the barley bread and the sun-baked dust. But even as the ritual offers peace, the relentless hand of time continues to carve its own story. For there is one wound that no ritual can heal, and one voice that history has tried to bury beneath the marble, the voice of the heart that refuses to be silent. The drums of the ritual have fallen silent, and the smoke of the sacred cedar has vanished into the rafters of the temple, leaving behind a stillness that is neither peace nor prayer. We have explored the ethereal realms where spirits are summoned and balance is sought through the unseen. Yet as the moon wanes over the ancient city, the focus shifts from the celestial to the visceral. There are wounds that no chant can close and fractures that no dream can mend. For those caught in the threshold between life and the grave, the last sanctuary is not a temple, but a table, a place where the sacred yields to the surgical. We move now from the mystical soul retrieval to the cold, iron-scented reality of the hand and the tool. In the ancient world, surgery was not a science of sterile rooms, but a high-stakes art form performed in the shadow of the inevitable. Welcome to the world of the artist of the blade. Imagine a modest room in a sun-baked house of mud bricks. There are no bright electric lights to guide the hand. There is only the flickering, amber glow of an oil lamp and the unforgiving heat of the Mediterranean afternoon radiating from the stone walls. The air is thick, a heavy blend of musk, vinegar, and the metallic tang of blood. In this space, the surgeon, part philosopher, part craftsman, and part gambler, prepares for an act of violent mercy. There is no anesthesia to soften the world, no chemical sleep to distance the patient from the agony. Instead, there is the leather strap, a simple, salt-bitten piece of hide that the patient must bite down on, a desperate anchor for a soul threatened by the waves of shock. In the ancient world, surgery was the ultimate, unvarnished confession of human fragility. To be a surgeon was to be a professional of the last resort, the one brave enough to cut into the very essence of life, hoping to draw health from pain. Before the artist lie the tools of his grim trade, iron knives, bone saws, and curved bronze needles. These are not mere implements. They are the extensions of a legacy that traces its lineage back to the master practitioners of the East and South. In India, the followers of Sushruta, the father of surgery, wielded over 120 specialized instruments, from delicate forceps to obsidian-sharp scalpels designed to navigate the labyrinth of the human frame. In Egypt, the SWNW used copper tools sterilized by the purity of fire, their movements dictated by the sacred geometry of the Ebers papyrus. The surgeon's hand must be steady, for in a world without antiseptics, even the smallest error, a simple, unintended cut, could invite the ghost of sepsis, an infection that turned a survival attempt into a death sentence. Every incision is a gamble against time and the invisible forces of decay. The artist of the blade does not just cut. He listens to the resistance of the sinew, he feels the rhythmic pulse of the humors, and he attempts to weave the shattered pieces of a life back into a coherent whole. Consider the technical marvels performed in these dim, smoke-stained chambers. While the common man might rely on boiled cabbage water or garlic compresses, the surgeon performs the impossible. In the valleys of India, Sushruta reconstructed the mutilated faces of the fallen, using flaps of skin from the cheek or forehead to rebuild a nose, a masterpiece of rhinoplasty that occurred millennia before the West could even name the procedure. In the military camps of the Roman legions, surgeons following the teachings of Galen operated with a terrifying, professional efficiency. They treated the torn flesh of the gladiator and the shattered bone of the soldier, using clamps and ligatures to halt the tide of blood. They were the architects of the bitter necessity, the ones who understood that to save the organism, one must sometimes sacrifice the limb. The bone saw, with its rhythmic, grinding music, was the sound of a brutal pragmatism that ensured the empire's survival. Perhaps the most profound testament to the ancient artist's skill is the practice of trepanation, the act of cutting a hole directly into the living skull to release the pressure of the brain or the spirits. Archaeologists uncover these skulls across the globe, finding evidence of bone regeneration that proves the patients survived these radical intrusions. With nothing more than coca leaves, fermented beer, or local herbs to dull the mind, these early specialists achieved survival rates that mock our modern assumptions of primitive life. It was a visceral prayer for relief, an opening of the sanctuary of the mind that required a courage and a precision that borders on the divine. What was the psychological weight of being the artist of the blade? Unlike the philosophers in the Agora who debated the just in abstract terms, the surgeon faced justice in the form of a bleeding wound. He carried the weight of the screams he could not silence and the memories of those who faded beneath his touch. To be a surgeon was to walk a tightrope between the arrogance of the Creator and the humility of the mortal. They understood that the body was not just a machine, but a system that could be knowable. Every success was a stolen moment from the gods, a defiance of the divine wrath that sought to return the clay to the earth. They were the first to treat the human being not as a passive victim of fate, but as a participant in their own destiny. They taught us that while the body is a slow-cooking oven of mortality, the mind and the hand can conspire to extend the light for one more hour. The tools are cleaned with vinegar and fire, and the surgeon wipes the iron-scented dust from his brow. The patient survives another night, their breathing shallow but steady in the cooling dark. The artist of the blade has completed his work, carving a brief truce between the mortal and the grave. But even as the flesh is mended, the spirit still yearns for a different kind of healing, a healing that comes not from the metal, but from the melody of the heart. The iron-scented echoes of the surgery have faded into the limestone silence, and the Nestor has been laid to rest, its work of mending the mortal frame complete. We have seen the body as a battlefield and the spirit as a cosmic scale, but as the physical wounds close and the breathing steadies in the cool Aegean night, a deeper, more persistent ache begins to resonate. It is a hunger that no herb can soothe and a fracture that no bronze needle can stitch, the ache of the unquiet heart. To find the source of this melody, we must travel across the salt-flecked waves of the northeastern Aegean to the emerald shores of Lesbos. Here, far from the sun-scorched arenas of war and the rigid logic of the assembly, the ancient world produced a voice so potent that Plato himself would name her the 10th muse. We move now from the mastery of the hand to the mastery of the soul. Imagine an island that breathes with a different rhythm than the rest of the Greek world. Lesbos was not a place of iron and law. It was a flourishing garden of art, music, and profound sensory indulgence. Here, the fertile valleys are draped in silver-green olive groves, and the air is a thick, heady perfume of crushed herbs and coastal winds. In the city of Mytilene, the bustling heart of this maritime paradise, music was not merely a decoration, it was a form of devotion. While the rest of the Hellenic world was obsessed with the grand epics of heroes and the masculine glory of the phalanx, Lesbos nurtured the lyric. This was a world of the lyre and the song, where the personal was sacred and the fleeting moment was worthy of a monument. It is against this backdrop of vibrant, moonlit sisterhoods and salt-scented sanctuaries that we find Sappho, a woman who would redefine the human voice by speaking not for the state, but for herself. Before Sappho, the Greek voice was a collective one. Poets sang of the we, the tribe, the army, the city. But Sappho performed a radical surgery on the human consciousness. She introduced the I. She did not sing of the fall of Troy or the wrath of Achilles. She sang of the tremble in a hand, the flush of a face, and the quiet, agonizing beauty of a single glance. She was the first to recognize that the interior landscape of a human heart is as vast and terrifying as any battlefield. In her Aeolic dialect, a language rich with softness and a unique, sighing rhythm, she crafted the sapphic stanza. It was a meter designed to mirror the rising and falling of the breath, ending in a shorter, punchy line that felt like the catch in a throat when the words finally fail. She was not a narrator of myths, she was a cartographer of longing. Sappho did not exist in a vacuum of solitary genius. She was the center of a thyasos, a sacred circle of aristocratic young women dedicated to music, poetry, and the cult of Aphrodite. In this rare, sheltered space of female community, the rigid boundaries of the ancient world were momentarily dissolved. These women were educated in the arts of grace and emotion, forming bonds that were intellectual, spiritual, and deeply romantic. Sappho addressed these women by name, Anactoria, Athis, Gongola, treating them not as abstract muses, but as visceral presences in her life. She wrote of their laughter, the way they braided their hair with violets, and the scent of their perfume. Her poetry was an intimate diary performed by lamplight, a world where the unexamined life was rejected in favor of a life examined through the lens of desire. To Sappho, a woman's departure to marriage was a tragedy as profound as any king's death, and her jealousy was a fire as elemental as the sun. At the heart of Sappho's universe sat Aphrodite, the golden-throned goddess of desire. To Sappho, Aphrodite was not a distant marble deity to be feared from afar. She was a confidant, a weaver of snares, whom the poet could summon with the familiarity of a friend. In her most famous fragments, Sappho speaks directly to the goddess, pleading for relief from the hard care of unrequited love. In this relationship, desire is not a sin or a weakness. It is a divine visitation. Aphrodite does not judge the poet's longing for another woman. She listens to the prayer and promises to bring her back. Through this sacred intimacy, Sappho elevated the scandal of the human heart into a form of worship. She taught the ancient world that love is not merely a human emotion, but a cosmic force that shakes the soul like the wind on the mountain troubling the oak trees. Yet, for all her fame, for all the centuries she was sung in the streets of Athens and the courts of Alexandria, the legacy of the 10th Muse is a history of shards. Of the 9 volumes of her poetry, once housed in the Great Library, almost nothing survives in its complete form. Her voice was nearly silenced by a succession of erasures. The fire that consumed Alexandria, the neglect of medieval scribes, and the deliberate destruction by later church officials who found her sensual, same-sex longing to be a threat to the moral order. For 1,000 years, Sappho was a ghost, a name mentioned by scholars but a voice that could no longer be heard. Her poetry became a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the sands of Egypt began to yield their secrets. At Oxyrhynchus, archaeologists found fragments of her verse scribbled on discarded papyri in ancient trash heaps, shards of emotion preserved by the desert. Each recovery, whether on a scrap of papyrus or a strip of mummy wrapping, felt like a resurrection. As her true voice faded into the silence of the centuries, a different, more palatable story was invented to replace it. Roman and Victorian traditions, uncomfortable with the reality of a woman who loved women, crafted the myth of the Leucadian leap. They claimed that Sappho, heartbroken over a ferryman named Phaon, threw herself from a white cliff to her death. This was a calculated act of historical revisionism, an attempt to transform a powerful, self-assured poet into a victim of unreturned heterosexual love. It was a neat, tragic ending that served to erase her identity. But the fragments we have recovered tell a different story. The story of a woman who faced her desires with unblinking honesty and who viewed even her suffering as a source of beauty. She did not need a heroic death to be immortal. Her immortality was already written in the meter of her song. What does it mean to be remembered only in fragments? In a way, the broken state of Sappho's work is a perfect metaphor for the human heart she spent her life describing. Love is never a complete, polished monument. It is a collection of fleeting glances, half-remembered melodies, and the persistent ache of what is missing. Sappho's legacy is not a statue of marble, but an immortal scar on the Western imagination. Her name gave birth to the language of identity. The words sapphic and lesbian are her eternal footprints on our culture. She remains a mirror for anyone who has ever loved in defiance of the world, or who has felt the bittersweet sting of a desire that cannot be named. She proved that while empires may crumble and libraries may burn, an emotion captured in perfect verse is a fire that can never be fully extinguished. The sun sets over the shores of Lesbos, and the Aegean waves continue their rhythmic, eternal lap against the stone. The 10th Muse is gone, her lyre long since turned to dust and her scrolls scattered to the winds. Yet, in the silence of the evening star, The star, she said, brings back all that the shining day has scattered. Her voice still whispers. She is the presence in the absence, the melody in the fragment, and the enduring truth of the heart that refuses to be silent. The song of Lesbos is not finished. It is merely waiting for the next heart to sing it. The melody of the lyre has faded into the salt-scented winds of Lesbos, and the bittersweet longing of the 10th muse has been swallowed by the relentless tide of the centuries. We have traveled from the sun-scorched mud of the first Greek homes to the blood-soaked defile of Britannia. We have stood in the shadow of the Parthenon and felt the heat of the funeral pyres during the Great Plague. But as our journey concludes, we must confront a tragedy more profound than the fall of any king or the slaughter of any legion. It is the tragedy of the void, the realization that the history we have explored is merely a collection of shimmering shards salvaged from an ocean of intentional and accidental silence. We enter now the final chamber of our narrative, where the ink has faded, the marble has crumbled, and the voices of millions remain trapped beneath the weight of a forgotten dust. Imagine the great library of Alexandria, once the beating heart of human intellect, housing 9 volumes of Sappho's Passion and the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. To the ancients, this was the ultimate sanctuary of the mind, a fortress built against the entropy of time. Yet, history is not a gentle preservation. It is a survivor of a massacre. The fires that consumed the library, whether set by the torches of conquerors or the neglect of the indifferent, were not merely the destruction of papyrus, they were the execution of memory. For every line of poetry we recite today, 1,000 songs have been reduced to ash. For every philosophical treatise that shaped the West, 100 radical ideas were silenced by the rising heat. We look back at ancient Greece and Rome through a keyhole, mistaking the narrow glimpse for the entire horizon. The tragedy of lost history is the knowledge that our golden age is a mosaic with most of its stones missing, a narrative rewritten by the winners, the survivors, and the censors. But the loss is not merely in the scrolls, it is in the people. We must return to the math of the ancient world that we encountered in the shadows of the silver mines and the silence of the gynaeconitis. History has always been a selective mirror, reflecting the 1% who held the spear or the stylus while casting the other 90% into the dark. Where are the names of the thousands of slaves who died in the toxic dust of Laurion, so that Athens could mint its pride in silver? Where are the stories of the women who spent their lives in the latticed prisons of their homes, their intellects stifled and their dreams unrecorded? They were the foundation of civilization, the living tools, and the invisible architects of the domestic sphere. Yet they have been buried without even a poorly carved stone to mark their existence. The unexamined life that Socrates feared was, for the majority of the ancient world, an erased life, a brief flicker of labor and pain that left no footprint on the marble of history. Beneath the modern streets of London, archaeologists dig through the soil and encounter a thick, dark vein of burnt clay and charcoal, the Boudiccan destruction layer. This is the physical signature of a trauma so deep it scarred the very earth. It is a reminder that history is often written in fire and blood before it is ever written in ink. But how many other destruction layers lie beneath our feet, unmarked and unexcavated? How many revolts were crushed so completely that not even a rumor of their defiance survived? In the ancient world, to be defeated was often to be deleted. The Romans redrew the maps and renamed the gods, attempting to cauterize the memory of the Iceni and the Trinovants. The tragedy of history is that for every Boudica who found her way into a Roman chronicle, 10,000 other rebels were ground into the mud, their cause forgotten and their names surrendered to the mist. We gaze upon the ruins of the Acropolis or the bronze statues at Westminster and feel a sense of permanence, a belief that these stones have captured the essence of the past. But a monument is often a mask. The Parthenon was built on the backs of the unfree. The democracy of the Knicks was defended by the deaths of those who could not vote. The statues we admire today are the idealized ghosts of a reality that was far more visceral, dirty, and desperate. The ancients did not live in a world of polished marble. They lived in a slow-cooking oven of mud bricks, plagued by lice, thirst, and the constant threat of a divine tantrum in the form of a plague or a lightning bolt. The tragedy is that we have romanticized the past to the point of unreality, losing the human heart, the sweat, the fear, and the resilience beneath the aesthetic of the ruin. Even the survival of Sappho's voice is a testament to the cruelty of time. Her poetry reaches us not as volumes, but as shards, phrases ripped from the trash heaps of Egypt or quoted as mere grammar lessons by scholars who did not care for her heart. Each fragment is a resurrection, a stolen moment of beauty that refused to stay buried. This is the ultimate metaphor for our understanding of the ancient world. We are like children piecing together a shattered urn by moonlight. We find a sliver of desire here, a fragment of a battle there, and we attempt to reconstruct a world that was once whole, vibrant, and terrifyingly alive. The shards of silence are all we have, the persistent echoes of a voice that history tried to muffle but could never fully extinguish. What, then, is our role in this landscape of loss? If history is a tragedy of erasure, then memory is a sacred act of rebellion. We do not study the ancient world to find a golden age. We study it to honor the struggle. We listen for the whispers in the gaps between the statues. We look for the soot in the layers of the soil. The ancient world teaches us that while the individual is ephemeral, the struggle for meaning is eternal. The Greeks and the Britons didn't just survive hardship. They created civilization while sweating through it. They questioned the gods, they fought the empires, and they turned their agony into a song that still vibrates in our own hearts. The tragedy is not that so much is lost, but that we might stop looking for what remains. To live an examined life in the modern age is to acknowledge the silence of the past and to speak for those who were never allowed to matter. The sun sets one last time over the imaginary horizon of our journey. The barley bread is gone, the bronze has rusted, and the scrolls have turned to dust. The ancient world has returned to the earth, leaving us with only the salt of the Aegean and the cold, gray mist of Britannia. But in the darkness, the flame still flickers. It is the flame of the human spirit, the spirit that says, "I will not kneel," the spirit that seeks the cosmic balance, and the spirit that writes a poem to a lover while the world burns. We are the keepers of the shards. We are the ones who must carry the lamp into the ruins and find the beauty in the brokenness. For as long as we remember the names of the silenced, as long as we feel the bittersweet sting of the ancient longing, the history is not truly lost. It lives in us, it breathes in the silence, and it waits forever in the shards.